all of us in this room, maps hold a special place in our hearts and in our jobs. How can AGS even think about having a symposium dealing with borders without a special session dedicated to maps? AGS Counselor Eddie Pickle and his panel are going to discuss international efforts at mapping the globe. And before they start, Dr. Josh Campbell, also an AGS counselor, is going to lay the groundwork for their discussion by giving us a brief presentation about mapping in response to humanitarian disaster. Josh?
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, be back on this stage. I've spent the last 10 years working in humanitarian mapping, and I will say, without a doubt, we have undergone nothing short of a revolution. And as the famous science fiction writer William Gibson said in 2003, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And the trends and the key elements that led to this humanitarian mapping revolution are 20 years old, the roots of them, but they will still continue to be the forces that push this revolution over the next 30 years into 2050 and beyond. So the first question, in the humanitarian world, it's not really, we used to joke at State Department, we didn't have a big data problem, we had a no data problem. And so sophisticated technology, a lot of times just didn't have a place because we didn't have the data volumes for it. But what I want you to think about in terms of how we think about this revolution in humanitarian mapping is we have to think through the lens of data, and we have to think about how data is produced and then how it's used. We can't really define success in humanitarian mapping unless that data and the results of those analysis and those maps actually result in policy decisions. And so it's not enough to just make the data. It has to be used to be successful. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, there has always been some element of mapping in humanitarian, this kind of very traditional GIS, but it has been driven and mashed together. The catalytic force that has driven this revolution has really been more related to the crowd. And so it's this fusion of data from a traditional perspective and an untraditional perspective that we also have to consider. So really, there's four components, I would argue, that kind of make up the milieu of how we think about the structure of this revolution. And on the left, we can think of technology and people. And really what this means, like what in the formal literature would be called commons-based peer production of knowledge, what we would informally call crowdsourcing, the combination of technology enabling people to do new things and communications ability to take disparate individuals and allow them to participate in collective action. Those social processes that first started with open source software, then moved into the Web 2.0 world, found their way into geospatial in the mid-2000s and has led to this production of geospatial data in new ways. And what that means is, on the right-hand side, the policies and the institutions all had to change. So the antecedents of some of the technologies that led to this revolution were based on policy decisions that got shifted. And then as things have evolved and as organizations have tried to adapt to this new world, they've had to change policy. And institutions, slow-moving bureaucratic institutions, have also had to change. So if we just throw a quick timeline, we're not going to understand how we got to this point in time unless we back up just a little bit. So really the start of the revolution was a policy change in the United States government that allowed for commercial high-resolution satellite remote sensing. The first bird, ICONOS, went up in 1999. That gave anybody who wasn't a nation state the ability to see things in high resolution on the ground. Then in 2000, shortly after that, Bill Clinton removed selective availability on GPS, which was the fuzz in the system, when we went from several hundred feet worth of resolution down to the couple of meters of resolution that we have now. Then in 2004, the OpenStreetMap project started. Think of OpenStreetMap as Wikipedia for maps. This became the architecture of participation. The place where all of this crowdsourcing effort could go is OpenStreetMap. At the same time, the State Department founded the Humanitarian Information Unit in 2003. It's one of the first times you start to see the bureaucratic institutions starting to adapt to bring more mapping into humanitarian. 2005, you have what is now like this, I call it the ignition in the public imagination about geography. When Google Maps and Google Earth launched, people's perspective changed on what the power of geospatial could be. And along with that came a whole slew of technologies that allowed people to visualize and create spatial data. And then in 2007, the iPhone was launched. And with that smartphone and the ability to combine all of those threads, we laid down all the technical components needed to power this revolution. So if we move forward just a couple more years, in 2009, as we start to see all of this start to congeal, the first Crisis Mappers Conference was held. At the same time, the next generation of high-resolution satellites were launched in 2009. Then the watershed event happened, the Haiti earthquake in January 2010. And that changed everyone's perspective about what could happen. Out of the earthquake was the birth of the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, and we also saw the World Bank launch the GFDR Innovation Lab and put significant investments into an open source library called GeoNode, or an application for sharing spatial data. So starting in 2010, then we see this like onslaught of change. 2011, the USAID opens up the GeoCenter. You saw Kerry Stokes earlier. At State Department, we started the Imagery to the Crowd project, and the UN started the Digital Humanitarian Network. 2014, this continues to grow. We see Missing Maps, MapGive, Youth Mappers, all of this stuff working around like, okay, these organizations are now adopting they're beginning to be able to utilize the data that's being produced. And then as we get to 2019 and we start going into the future, what we're really looking at are three major changes. This onslaught of data that's going to come from microsatellite constellations, machine learning, and new ways of powering the crowd. So this is just a screenshot from Haiti. All it's really showing is it was the first time where lots of imagery led to the creation of data. Again, this is not in a vacuum. This is the USAR Urban Search and Rescue team from Fairfax, Virginia, on the ground in Port-au-Prince for the first time using OpenStreetMap on their Garmins to conduct operations. The watershed event. So if you don't know what OpenStreetMap is, this video will give you a sense of the scale and magnitude of this project. Every little line, every little flash is what's called a change set. You'll see the calendar in the lower left-hand corner starting in 2007. Look at what sort of global phenomenon this thing unleashed. This data is all produced by volunteers, either walking around with a GPS on the ground or tracing satellite imagery and checking those like resulting vectors into the database. And what you see is countries everyone coming online. So now we're in 2010 timeframe. And you start to see Africa really start picking up pace as the humanitarian efforts in that continent. All volunteer, all free and open for anybody to use. So I just pulled this stat deck out of the OpenStreetMap library. This is the total cumulative amounts of edits that have been made. That video that you saw in 2014, 2.7 billion nodes in the database. In the last 5 years, we've doubled that. So we're reaching exponential growth rates just in production of data from very elementary sources. So I'm going to move quickly. The Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team in 2018 had 23 disaster responses. So this is like after a disaster happens, everyone kind of comes in and maps. But then the question is, well, why aren't we dealing with sustainable development and resilience? Why aren't we mapping ahead of time? This is the distribution of hot projects around the world where they're doing that on the ground mapping and training before a disaster happens. The UN has fully adopted this kind of paradigm, and this is the humanitarian data exchange, in which OpenStreetMap data is now being exported and put into HDX along with more of that traditional GIS. The impending revolution that we haven't really gotten to is microsat constellations, drone imagery, and then I think ground-based imagery is going to completely change how much data can be mapped. And what you're seeing here is what's called semantic segmentation. So the ability of a machine to go in, look at an image, and extract objects intelligently in X, Y, and Z, right? So now we're talking in third dimension as well. This was just released, MapSwipe 2.0, so this is a way to better organize the crowd. So now you don't have to necessarily map, but you can help the mapping process on your phone or on a web browser. This is Facebook's new application called the Rapid Editor. It's like modifying human mapping with artificial intelligence and machine learning applications. And again, they're all focused on the humanitarian applications as how they're going to prioritize the development of this. And so that growth curve that you saw that was all human powered, once the machines fully kick in, it's going to be an incredible amount of data. And so I would just leave you with this question. We know that the technology and the people are all going to continue to grow and change. What does that mean for our policy and our institutions? Are we ready to deal with this? Do we have the leadership that's smart enough on the tech and the data to actually essentially get torque to the wheels? Are we going to be able to make smarter and better decisions with all of this data? So thank you. I went over a little over time.
Thank you.